So I've been thinking on Exodus chapter 17 a lot this week, and I know Peter Price is here, so he's shared this already, so sorry, Peter. But been thinking about Exodus 17, so if you want to turn there, I'll read the first 7 verses, and I'll give myself a title today. So my title is From Mary Bell to Mary Bar. So hopefully that'll make sense by the end of this thought. But here we go, Exodus 17, 1-7. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will stand there before you by the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So Mary Bell, let's start there. Mary Bell is a little ski resort in the French Alps. It used to be one of my favorite places to go skiing pre-kids. And when I used to travel out to Mary Bell, I'm Welsh and tight. So I used to hate buying any refreshments on the way. So I'd have one bottle of water and I would try to make it last the whole journey from the Welsh valleys to the French Alps. And increasingly, as you kind of, go on the journey and then go on the bus for the last 3 or 4 hours, as you're going up higher in altitude and that kind of circulated air in a bus, the water would get less and less and less and less. And I would get more and more thirsty until we'd arrive in the kind of lodge in Mary Bell, and all I'd have left in the bottle would be just this warm kind of dregs of what was probably 87% my own saliva in the bottle. And that kind of feeling of thirst was really uncomfortable and horrible. And I'd be desperate for a drink when I get there. Now, today is about thirst in Exodus chapter 17, and they're having an extreme reaction to thirst. They start complaining, they start grumbling, they start looking back at Egypt and saying, "Do you know what, maybe it was better being slaves than this." And then more than that, Moses gets so freaked out, he starts to think they're going to stone him. I think it's fair to say that, as psychologists would say, there was a clear case of catastrophizing going on all sides. It seems that as soon as the water dried up in the wilderness, so too did their faith. Now the question is, was that the right thing to do? I know we say they shouldn't have complained and grumbled, but deep down, I mean, if you've ever been thirsty or wondered where the next drink's coming from, actually in a desert, imagine if you had family, imagine if you had a baby. I mean, of course you'd freak out if there was no water. But actually, when you read Exodus 17 in this context, it is a bit of a silly response, isn't it? They've already been saved from slavery. God has rescued them. But as well, you get Exodus 15, which has one of my favorite verses. I love Exodus 15 and verse 27. And if the name for the church hadn't been kind of hijacked for a certain brand of church in the UK, I would love this name. And this is why we should all want to be in an Elim church. Have a listen to verse 27. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. I mean, what an all-inclusive kind of holiday that is, with a kind of pool and constant stream of drink and coconuts and mango and everything else that they would have had. I mean, God does amazing things. And then, Exodus 16, you get the manna and the quail. It's all there. God has saved them and God is sustaining them. God has given provision for them to come out of Egypt, and God is providing for them. Really, when it comes to Exodus 17 and the water dries up, their faith shouldn't have dried up, because the evidence was overwhelmingly in God's court. God will provide. God is generous. God can do it. So interestingly, in the New Testament, Paul picks up on it in 1 Corinthians 10, and he looks back and says, look, Christians, this is a warning for us. Actually, that we can set our hearts on evil things. There's a warning here. That really what the Israelites had done was set their hearts on the water. We want water, we want water. They hadn't really set their hearts on God, on Yahweh, who was saving them. So when the water stopped, they panicked because they weren't looking to God and they weren't trusting in him. They really hadn't grasped his character. And because of that, because they weren't looking at the overwhelming evidence, they were just looking at water's dried up, let's freak out. Now, I love the fact that Paul looks at it and says it's a warning. They set their hearts on evil things, gives us the kind of inside track. But when you read the passage, I love the way God responds. God responds graciously by giving them water. But more than that, and I find this really interesting, it's the way he gets them to get the water. So he says to Moses, verse 5, to get the staff which struck the Nile, which is interesting because it is a symbol of God's power and provision, but it was also against Egypt, a symbol of judgment in a sense, turning the water into blood. So there's a bit of a reminder here of God and what he can do, but ultimately he provides for that. And so they call the place Meribah, which means quarreling. Remember how you quarreled with the Lord and tested him. So let's go back to Mary Bell. When I used to go to Mary Bell, I used to love going into the lodge because the first thing I would do is I'd take my little bottle and then I would tip out the last little bit of the dregs of my phlegm, that warm, horrible stuff. And I would turn on the tap, and the glacial water that flowed out of the tap was absolutely stunning. The best water you can drink, second only to Brecon Carreg water from West Wales. It was absolutely phenomenal. You could leave the tap running all day and all night. That water was going to keep coming. Can you imagine if I turned up in Mary Bell with my bottle and just hugged my bottle and freaked out at the staff? Look at the state of my bottle. Look at what's in here. This is rubbish. I need. They would have gone, just turn the tap on. You've been here enough times. You know the deal. And it's exactly the same with us. I feel as an individual Christian, I so often forget God's goodness and God's generosity and God's provision. And I catastrophize, I freak out. And actually God just wants me to come to him. And I think as churches as well, I find in church leadership, it's really easy to freak out. So the kind of growth starts to dry up. God's kind of blessing on the church seemingly seems to dry up. And then my faith dries up. And then I kind of cry out and I catastrophize. But I think we need to look back and see those Elim moments, see what God has done. And when we look back and see him, what he's done and who he is, we can trust him for now. And I guess that's what this prayer meeting is about, is not just believing that Elim is historic and revival is historic, but actually God is at work now. God hasn't changed, and God can provide. So let's not complain, let's not grumble. Let's pray and trust in him.